We're actually going to cover 2 I am statements of Jesus today, and yet to understand it, we're going to have a little tidbit of cultural context that we don't normally have. But before we dive into the actual passage, I want to just recap for you what we saw last week, because what we saw last week is going to get alluded to this week, and it's also really relevant to what happened this week. In fact, our conversation that we're reading about this week starts kind of abruptly, and it's really, last week we saw, it's a continuation of that conversation. Last week we saw there was a blind man who'd been blind from birth, and Jesus came with his disciples and found this man, and Jesus healed the guy, and the guy got chewed out by the Pharisees because they wanted to disprove that it was a miracle or disprove that Jesus caused the miracle if it was, and they were going after Jesus because he had healed this guy on the Sabbath, and they thought that was unreasonable, and not really paying attention to the fact that, hey, this guy's blind and now he can see, so that's pretty significant. And in fact, by the end of the passage, we saw that this poor blind guy who had lived as a beggar the first half of his life is now suddenly able to see, and within about a 24-hour period, he goes from having everything to suddenly losing everything else. And he still has his vision, but he's kicked out of the synagogue. He's kicked out by the Jewish leaders. He's not allowed to have his friends and neighbors and family in the way that he does anymore. And then Jesus comes and finds him and invites him in to follow him, to acknowledge him as the Messiah and be part of his kingdom. And so that, as our passage ends, we see that happening, and Jesus is having this confrontation with the Pharisees where they say, Jesus makes a comment about how I've come here to make those who have vision blind and those who are blind have vision. And we talked about how he's not talking about physically that's what he's going to do, but it's a spiritual reality. And the Pharisees read the insinuation and say, are you talking about us? Are you saying we're blind? And Jesus, as the last chapter leaves off, kind of says, actually, you'd be better off if you were blind, because at least then you'd have an excuse. But you've seen everything, you admit you've seen everything, and because you've seen all the evidence for who I am as the Messiah, and you're still rejecting me, your sin is still going to sit on you. Like, you're not going to escape that. And so that's where our passage left off last week. And again, we're picking up right from there, and we're going to continue that dialogue going forward. Chapter 10 is really going to kind of round out this movement of the passage that is looking at sort of this time frame. And so we'll get to see more of this interaction come to its fulfillment 6 months out from Jesus' crucifixion. Seeds are getting planted, people are getting told truth, and they're wrestling with it, trying to figure out what to do with it. So let's take a moment right now and come before the Lord in prayer, and then we'll jump into chapter 10 and begin with verses 1 through 6. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to study your word. Lord, we probably read and heard and watched a lot of things this week, and yet nothing is more important than what we see in your word. And so, Father, I pray that with humble hearts and with minds open to you, that you'd speak to us through your word. What I say isn't really as important, Lord. I just pray that you would convict us of who you are as the good shepherd, as the sheep gate. That you'd help us to see that in our life and ask that sober question of whether we hear your voice or not, whether we listen to you or not. Please guide this, we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Now I'm going to read this first section, and then I'll warn you, I'm going to have to stop for a minute and give you guys some context, because it'll be essential to understanding our passage today, but you might actually find it interesting too, so that'll be a perk, hopefully. Let's go ahead and start off with chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they'll run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Okay, so we're going to need to know a lot about shepherding and sheep, and especially shepherding and sheep in the ancient world, because it's a little different than it is today. Let me ask, just out of curiosity, how many people here have ever kept sheep as pets before? Okay, we got a few of you that have some experience in that, not as pets. As livestock. As livestock. Thank you, Audrey. That's more appropriate. Yeah, I should say that. Yeah, they are delicious. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if my dog is or not, but anyway. So to your point, So in the ancient world, I just want to summarize kind of what the daily life of a shepherd was like, because if you don't know that, you aren't going to get what he's talking about. But to be clear, for his audience who's hearing this, over 90% of their society is agrarian, and sheep are one of the most common livestock animals to own. So most of these people would have known firsthand a shepherd or had a family member who was a shepherd. They would have understood this because they would see it all over. If you walked outside of your town, and most people didn't have a chariot to ride back then, unless you were uber rich, you wouldn't even have a horse or a donkey or something like that unless you were wealthy. So for the average citizenry, they're going to be walking wherever they're going, traveling somewhere, and they're going to see this everywhere they look. This is going to be right in front of them. But if you were a shepherd in the ancient world, you would go to the livestock pen where your sheep were kept overnight. They'd be there overnight. Now, sometimes it'd be an actual pen, and sometimes it would be a cave. And always, though, it would have one entryway to it. And that entryway, it depended on the format, and we'll see it both sort of systems alluded to here, but if you were a larger farmer who had your own pens and you had enough sheep to justify that, then you'd bring your own sheep in, and then often you or one of your shepherds would actually go and they would sleep in the gateway of that pen all night when the sheep were there. And the idea was the sheep are comforted by you, you're there to protect them from predators, and there's only one way in and out of this, and so you effectively are the gate as you're doing this. And so the shepherd would come each morning if he wasn't the one laying in the gateway, and he would call out his sheep, and the sheep of the shepherd would actually know his name. They would recognize him and follow him based on that. Now, to add a little complexity to this, for some people who had smaller herds, they would actually share a cave or they would share a corral for their sheep together. And the interesting part is the sheep in the ancient world knew the sheep keepers well enough, knew the shepherds well enough, that even then, if a shepherd came up and he called for a sheep, they would walk out and they would follow him. His sheep would know him. Now, if there was a bunch of people keeping sheep together, typically they'd hire somebody to come, and he would be the one who laid in the gateway, but he'd watch the sheep all night. And if they did that, normal social etiquette was only the person who's the chief shepherd could actually walk into that pen at night, because they didn't want all the different people going in there and meddling with the sheep. If they weren't, the sheep that aren't yours are going to get nervous by you being present. So the shepherd would come in, he'd call his sheep, and they would follow him out. Now, most people nowadays, if they're moving sheep, they herd them. They might use dogs or something like that, and they'd move them from behind. But in the ancient world, that wasn't the case. These sheep had such a tight relationship with their shepherd. This guy was with them 24/7, that they would follow and walk with the person and be led by them right out. And the shepherd was responsible to know where the good grazing grounds were. He was responsible for keeping the sheep safe during the day. And after he'd gone through a day of that, each night he would bring them back, he'd walk in front of them and lead them back to where their corral was. And traditionally, as the sheep went in, that shepherd, he would actually physically inspect every sheep and see, do you have any cuts? Do you have any wounds? Do you have any insect infestations that you shouldn't have? And they had custom-built oils and salves they would use to put on the sheep if they had any problems with that. Some of those ancient oils they would mix together actually had antibiotic properties, and so they could rub those onto a wound and actually help it heal. And so the shepherds knew the name of every single sheep in their herd or in their flock. They would watch over them, they'd lead them in there, and then they'd leave them there for the night. And again, in some cases, if it was a smaller flock, they would be the gate for the sheep. They'd actually be laying in that position. Occasionally there was a physical gate, but that was actually less common in the ancient world. And otherwise there'd be somebody who tended the gate, who watched it and took care of it. So this is the pattern of behavior that we're sort of alluding to here. We don't see this in our daily lives, and so it's probably a little less familiar. Now Jesus is using this as an example, and so he's going to directly address, notice in verse 1 there, he says, "Very truly I tell you," so this is important, this is kind of fact you could live or die on. "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees," he's got a specific audience, these religious leaders who've been attacking him. He says to them, "Anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in another way, is a thief or a robber." And in principle, this would be true. Even if you, and there's accounts of this in the ancient literature, even if you dressed up like a shepherd and you did your best to impersonate his voice, those sheep were actually clever enough, they could tell an imposter from somebody who was supposed to be there, and their normal response wasn't to come over and hope you pet them. They would dart. They would run away from you and try to get away from you. And so if you were trying to steal sheep, then normally you would do one of two things. You'd try to sneak into the sheep pen and get a hold of them, or you'd try to sneak around behind the shepherd who was guarding the gate and use physical force or coercion. So Jesus talks about if you're a thief or a robber, you're not normally just going to go to the front gate. You're going to try to be subversive and sneak around. Maybe you'll use physical force. or maybe you'll just use guile and trickery. But regardless, that's normally the way you do things. And the accusation here is to the Pharisees, that's what you guys are doing. They're coming into God's kingdom. They're coming among God's flock, but they don't care about God's people. They have no concern for them. They're just interested in enriching themselves. They're going to take what they want from the flock and exploit it, and when they're done, they're done. Verse 2, by contrast, he says, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. So here's two distinctions. If the person who's actually allowed to use the front door of the pen is the person that chief shepherd is entrusted with caring for the sheep, and there's some distinctions here. The person who runs the gate knows, oh, okay, that person's allowed to be here. They're the chief shepherd. They can come in and be a part of it. And the sheep also know the shepherd's voice and follow it. They understand that. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Most shepherds in the ancient world actually did name their livestock. They had names for them and knew them each individually. And so that was, again, it was a very loving relationship. And it's intriguing because, even today, it's not common for people to be able to walk around and have all their sheep follow them around as they go. But that earned trust between animal and human was so significant that they could do this in this time, in this part of the world, whereas very few people today are able to do so. So Jesus points that out. Verse 4, when he has brought out all his own, so he's separated out his own sheep from the others, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. Now, Jesus is pointing out a distinction here. You've got to figure out this metaphor. We're going to find out in a minute. Jesus is going to be really clear. He's the shepherd that we're talking about. So there are people who are coming into the church and who are trying to exploit it. They're only looking for what they want and what they can gain out of it and what will make them look good. Have you guys heard about pastors like that before? Have you heard about church leaders like that before? Sadly, we know that exists. Yeah, and that's a dangerous thing. And yet, we in this are the sheep, but notice there's other herds. We don't have to be in that herd. We're in the herd if we listen to the voice, which raises that question that we're going to keep seeing here of, whose voice do you actually listen to? In your day-to-day life, when God speaks and the world speaks, whose ways do you follow? That's an interesting question. Verse 5, but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they'll run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. So here's a distinction. Whoever your shepherd is, you're going to know their voice and you're going to follow them. If Jesus tells you to do something and your first impulse is to run away, maybe Jesus isn't your Lord. Maybe you're not really with him. And yet, if you do, well, then that's a good sign. Then you obviously have a heart for him and you're following him. And Jesus, verse 6 tells us, he explained this to the Pharisees, but the Pharisees just didn't get it. They didn't understand what on earth he was talking about. They're confused by it. So Jesus is now going to elaborate on this more. And in the next set of verses 7 through 10, Jesus is going to use his third I am statement that we see. We've seen him use so far 2 different I am statements talking about who he is, that he is, for example, the bread of life, that he supplies the basic sustenance we need in our lives, that he is the light of the world, which he just talked about in the last chapter, that he illuminates and shows us who we are and what the world is around us and leads us through the perils of life. He does all of that. And now Jesus is going to add another I am statement to that. We're actually going to get 2 of them today. But the first one's going to be here in verses 7 through 10. He's already implied some of it, but he'll spell it out more. So verse 7. Therefore Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. Okay, so notice it's got that therefore at the beginning, and of course there's that old joking line that's true. We got to figure out what's that there for. Why is that there? And it's referring back to the Pharisees not understanding. He explained this. The Pharisees didn't understand. So based on that fact that they aren't getting what he's saying, he's trying to elaborate on it more and spell out exactly what's going on in the imagery he used in the opening of the passage. So he says, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. Now, when I first read that, I thought, isn't that weird that he's referring to himself as an inanimate object? But as we talked about a minute ago, actually a shepherd, especially if he was watching his own flock and he didn't mix his flock with another, he would actually go and be the person who laid there in the doorway. He would be the one who kept predators from getting into the corral, and if need be, who would allow the sheep out of the corral. But nobody got past him as he laid in that position. So Jesus is making an exclusive statement here. He's saying, there's only one entrance to the corral, and I'm it. I'm the only way you get into the sheep pen. I'm the only way you get into God's kingdom. And he points out, by contrast, all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. Now, he's not referring to the Old Testament prophets or to Moses or people like that. In fact, Moses in the Old Testament is sometimes referred to as a shepherd. We see God referred to in the 23rd Psalm as a shepherd. So there's people who have been good at taking care of God's flock. But here, we can see in like the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah examples of those prophets specifically calling out the pastors and the politicians of their days and saying, you guys are bad shepherds. They've been called that. And so there's been this lineage of leadership among the Jewish people. And sadly, we see some continuance of that lineage today in our church, where, the church broadly, that is to say, where there's corrupt leaders who come in and they're only interested in themselves. Now, let me point out, he's calling out the Pharisees for this, and you might think, well, why is he giving them so much flack? Why does he keep digging into the Pharisees like this? But just to review briefly some of the stuff we've seen in the interactions with the Pharisees. When the Pharisees saw a man who was lame at the pool of Bethsaida, who hadn't been able to walk throughout his whole life, and he was healed, and he was walking around and doing better, were they elated for how well God's lamb was doing in that situation? They didn't care at all. They could care less about him. In fact, they used him as a prop to try to attack Jesus. They totally ignored the miracle and indicted Jesus for healing the guy, when really, if they really loved the people God had given them to shepherd over and watch out for, they would have been elated. They would have been excited. I mean, imagine if somebody you loved and you cared about had been crippled and never able to walk a day in their life, and suddenly they were able to walk again. Would the high point for you in that be, oh, but he was carrying a mat around? Or would it be, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This person's been in a wheelchair their whole life. Now they're walking around. And so the Pharisees, they didn't even care about that. And we saw a few chapters ago where there was a woman who was caught in adultery and brought before the Pharisees. The Pharisees then bring her to Jesus, and they didn't honor her humanity at all. They didn't treat her with any sort of dignity or respect. They were using her as a physical prop and her embarrassing situation as a way to try to leverage Jesus and take advantage of him. They could care less about her. And again, with the blind man, you'd think somebody blind from birth, they don't even know this guy's name. They don't know his background. He's somebody they're responsible to spiritually watch over. They're his pastor, effectively. They're also the political leader in his area. And despite that, they could care less that he's actually healed. They ignore it. It's really all about, how can we use this to get after Jesus? How can we use this to make sure he doesn't undermine our power? What we want, what we desire, that is first and foremost. That's what we've got to focus on. That's got to be the priority. They're not actually living that out in the proper way at all. And so Jesus is highlighting that. He's pointing out to them, you guys feel so smug and so good about yourselves, and you're constantly patting yourselves on the back. You constantly do showy things to try to bring attention to yourselves. But you guys are thieves and robbers. You pretend to be somebody who's here to provide entry into heaven for God's people, to provide a relationship, to facilitate a relationship with God for God's people, but you don't care about God's people at all. You're all about you. And so he says in verse 9 there, I am the gate. He's the way. Whoever enters through me will be saved. Now, I'll say, when Jesus makes statements like this, I know in our modern world it makes some people uncomfortable. They hear stuff like this and they say, well, yeah, but what about all the Buddhists? And what about all the Muslims? And what about all the Hindus? Like, why are we so exclusive? Why can't we just say that every doorway can lead you to heaven, that everybody can get you there? They're all just paths to the same end. Notice Jesus is really clear that isn't the case, and he's really clear that isn't the case because none of those other religions deal with the problem of your sin. None of them have a way to atone for your sin that divides you from God. And so there isn't this fixing of the relationship. And I know that in the modern world, we want to think that anything can be true as long as you believe it is. But is that the case? And I'll say, you might feel like it was judgmental of me to say that airplanes were not meant to fly into outer space or not meant to fly through mountains. There's only one medium that airplanes are meant to fly through. And you might think that's totally judgmental and small-minded of me. But I can assure you, if you try to take the airplane in either of those two other environments, try to fly them through the earth, try to put them into outer space, you're going to find out pretty quick, they don't work there. Your life is going to be in danger. And Jesus' statement, it's not cruel, it's not judgmental, if it's true. And it's true. So we've got one way we can be made right with God. We've got one entryway into the corral, and Jesus is the one at the gate. And so we've got to be ready to join his flock and to walk with him and do that. There are other people who are going to try to tell us, no, listen to my voice instead. I'm the shepherd. I'm the access point for God. I'm the one who's going to give you the way. But if you listen to them, you listen to them at your own peril. You can perish for it. And Jesus here provides a contrast between the two different types of leadership that are going on here. The Pharisees' leadership, generally, I'm sure there's some decent people among the Pharisees. We see some examples of that, like Nicodemus. But the Pharisees who are here are not in that ilk. They're definitely not interested in people. So he gives this contrast in verse 10. The thief, who he's pointed out as them, comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Well, this is them, but it's also the way of the devil. And so, really, poor leaders, that's what they're here for. They don't care if you get hurt. They don't care if you get slaughtered as long as they get fed, as long as what they want, as long as their needs are met. It's irrelevant. And because of their lack of love for the people they're supposed to be caring for, their people they're caring for suddenly become expendable. And again, this will be built on even more in the future verses. And yet Jesus provides this contrast. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. I think sometimes when non-believers hear about the Christian life, they think of the Christian life as, this is just a list of things you can't do. We just hand you this list. And remember, here's 10,000 things. Don't you ever do any of them, or we're going to come and chew you out for it. Is that actually what the Christian life is about? No. It's actually about a fulfilled and satisfying life. That's what Jesus offers. And yeah, there'll be trial, tribulation, and persecution. There's going to be hardship in it. But generally speaking, funny thing about following God is when you live out your marriage the way that God says to live out your marriage, it goes better. And when you work at your job the way that God says to work for your employer, your employment goes better. God opens doors and things just go smoother. And when you're a parent the way, or a grandparent the way that God calls you to be, or a kid to your parents the way that God calls you to be, like it can be hard at times, but it's much more fulfilling. God isn't calling us to a bunch of broken rule following. God is calling us to the fullness of what life can be. He created this world and everything in it. He knows how it works, and He's inviting you to live in it in the way that it best functions. It's not just some list of rules, and shame on you if you don't just follow the rules. It's important to listen to Him, but not because He's some tyrant who wants to rule over you, but because He knows how things work, and He's offering you this abundant life, this full and fulfilling life. And I got to say, I've as a pastor, I've got to sit next to a lot of people's bedsides while they pass away. And I never got the sense that people had an easier time dying because they were rich. I never got the sense that people had an easy time dying because they were powerful. In fact, if anything, sometimes that made it a bigger struggle. But people who lived godly lives, that focused on the things that God says to focus on instead of the things that society says to focus on, that heard the good shepherd's voice and yielded to it instead of the voice of this world, boy, those people have a lot more satisfying time in that process. They have a lot more peace because the things that were important were the things they paid attention to. That's what Jesus is inviting you to. This world has all kinds of things it wants you to listen to and prioritize, and yet God knows what's best for you, and He's inviting you to that. Let's continue on. We're going to get our next I am statement, our fourth I am statement, verses 11 through 13. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So, when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So now we've added another position, another person. We've talked about thieves and sheep and shepherds and robbers, and now we're adding a few more characters. We're adding to this narrative real world things that exist with a deeper heavenly meaning again. There's the hired hand, and a hired hand, is a part-time worker. You're paying some of the time to cover for the shepherd. But Jesus points out, you don't ever expect the same level of care from the hired hand. Maybe if they have really great integrity, you'd find it. But that's pretty rare. Most of the time, if you're going to pay me minimum wage, I just don't know how much I care. And that's not the way I should approach it, but that's the way we tend to approach it. And so here's this shepherd. out in the field, and a wolf comes up, and can the wolf kill the shepherd just as easily as the sheep? Absolutely. And he doesn't own the sheep. They're not his anyway. And Jesus points out, if you're a hired hand and you see that, you're probably not going to stick around and fight that wolf to the death. And it's not the modern era where at least you'd have a nice rifle or something to do it with. You've got your sling or your club or some basic tools like that. And I don't know how much you like your odds, but it doesn't seem very exciting to me. If you put me in a cage with a wolf, I'm not sure I'd enjoy how that would work out. But if the hired hand, that's the math. They run off, the sheep get scattered, they get eaten and devoured. When something like this happens, it's not uncommon for the shepherd not to be able to recover the sheep. And he may get some small percentage of them back, but these animals will run off like crazy and won't even necessarily look back, and they can become feral or just simply die from predation. Sheep are not animals that have a great countermeasure against predatory animals. And so Jesus is pointing out here that I'm the good shepherd. And then what qualifies him, verse 11, as the good shepherd? Well, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's a distinction. The good shepherd is willing to serve and to die at the convenience of those that he serves. And that's exactly what Jesus is actually going to do. He's going to fulfill that. Now, I think this is interesting. I can't help but think of, I had a pastor here a couple years ago I heard from, who was, he is like 4 hours from here. As a peer, but he was talking about how, I'm just not really into the shepherding part of my job. Like, I like to teach on Sunday mornings, but I don't want to deal with the weddings and the funerals and the hospital calls and all of that. That just seems like a hassle, And so I want to be a pastor, but I just want to do the teaching on the Sunday morning. Are you a pastor if that's all you're doing? If that's all you have a heart for? No, not really, or certainly not in a smaller context like this, but even if you were at a mega church and that was your primary role, if you don't love the people underneath you, if you don't care for them, you're no good shepherd at all. You're not really doing your job. And so on the one hand, I saw that and I couldn't help but think, as well as I read this passage of years ago when Annabelle and I started in our first formal church ministry in Grangeville, Idaho. In the first couple weeks we were up there, Linda Gott, who was the lead pastor's wife, she was also the secretary at the church. We sat down and we were praying at the beginning of the week. And one of the first things I remember hearing Linda pray, and it stuck with me all these years, was she was praying, Lord, please help us to have the love for these people that you have for them. Help us to see them as you see them and to love them as you love them. Well, that's a heart for people. That's somebody who cares about the people around them. That's a big contrast. And, we can see this in the church as a whole, these different paradigms of leadership. It's about my ego and it's about me, and let's get some billboards up. And it happens at the higher levels of ministry, but it can happen at the lower levels too, right? We can have people who are tyrants over the departments that they lead, or it's a big ego trip for them. It can even happen individually for us. We can go and try to share Christ with our friends or neighbors by beating them over the head with our Bibles, or we can try to share Christ with them because we love them and we care about them. And, they'll know the difference between that. I remember years ago, as I was starting ministry, I went and visited church at my last Sunday before I was formally a pastor. I visited a church led by my former youth pastor and his wife. And they had taken the youth group at our church from in Ontario, Oregon, from around a dozen kids to over 200. So they'd had a huge impact. And I asked them as we were talking to them after service that Sunday, Annabelle and I asked, what's your biggest piece of advice you give somebody starting out in ministry? And the first piece of advice they gave us was, if you really love people, then they'll know that. And if you don't really love people, well, then they'll know that too. Well, that was good advice. Know with Jesus, He really loves you. There are broken people on earth. I'm sure I have moments of good and bad. I hope I'm erring more on the side of good. I hope all our leadership is. But in general, Jesus is pointing out here, I am the good shepherd. And Jesus proves this at a level that is hard to defeat. He proves it because He will, in fact, lay down His very life for the salvation of the people He cares about. He's not just going to go and fight the wolf. He's going to go fight the wolf knowing with 100% certainty that he'll die doing it, that it will cost him his life. And yet, as we'll find out later, it'll cost him that, and yet he'll be able to raise it, take it back, something you and I couldn't do. But He is that good shepherd. So He elaborates more on that in verses 14 through 18. Let's read that. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay down my life on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up. This command I received from the Father. Okay, so there's several things happening here. In the bigger movement of it, though, he's now reiterating that he's the good shepherd, and he's going to talk about characteristics of that. And we've heard this several times. I know my sheep, verse 14, and my sheep know me. You think there's a reason we keep hearing this verse, this phrase here again and again? Again, whose voice are you listening to in your life? When you're making decisions about your life, when you're deciding the kind of man or woman you're going to be, the kind of husband, wife, grandparent, employee, you name it, whatever role you're playing in your life, the way you're going to handle your money even. Are you doing this in the way that Jesus says to do it, or are you doing it in the way that the world and your whims say to do it? Because if you're one of his sheep, then you'll listen to the shepherd's voice. But if you're just doing it your way, well, then you probably won't. But he points out, I know them and they know me. And notice how much he knows us, he points out. Verse 15, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. How well does Jesus know the Father? Or does the Father know Jesus? About as much as you could know anyone. In fact, I think we could make a very reasonable argument that Jesus knows every one of us a lot better than we know ourselves. He loves us that much. And he doesn't just know us as an intellectual curiosity. He knows us as a loving shepherd who cares about us. He sees us every day. He's looking us over, just like the shepherd did on the way into the pen. He's looking us over. He's checking us out for wounds or cuts. He's trying to draw our attention through his word to how we need to change our lives and be more his and do that. And so he says, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Verse 16, it's kind of confusing at first, but really here he's talking about the Gentiles and about how the church is not limited to the Jewish people. And in fact, as we can see in this example he's giving it, not all sheep are his sheep. There are sheep out there that don't belong to him. There are sheep out there that don't listen to him. So there are Jewish people in this community who reject him as the Messiah, and they aren't going to be part of the kingdom. And yet there are people among the Gentiles. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. He's talking about how he's going to evangelize the Gentiles and win over people outside of Judaism to come into his kingdom. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Now to us, you might look back and say, well, of course, that's what happened. To the Jewish people, this would have been kind of revelatory. This would have been kind of very significant to say that it's not just going to be the Jewish people that have a connection with God, but God's going to go out and win thousands of people, millions of people among the Greeks and the barbarians to come and be a part of his flock as well. Verse 17, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. So God loves Jesus because of this purpose that he's fulfilling. This is a part of what causes this love between them. Now, I think verse 18 is extremely significant because I think there's some crazy theological ideas that come if we don't understand this. He says, no one takes it from me, he's talking about his life, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. Years ago, I read in the Idaho Statesman, back when I was at Boise Bible College, I read an article from a local female pastor who was arguing that Jesus Christ didn't really die. He wasn't, he was a historical person, but he certainly didn't die on the cross. And anybody who thinks Jesus died on the cross believes in divine child abuse. That just makes God an abuser who beats up his kids and doesn't care about them. There are people who try to make that argument. Sadly, again, we're talking about somebody who claims to be a pastor making that argument. Kind of makes you wonder, why are you bothering with Christianity if Jesus didn't die and if he never made a sacrifice? Notice in this passage, Jesus is crystal clear. Jesus isn't being forced with a gun to his head to go lay down his life. God, in his sovereignty, has provided Jesus to this end, but Jesus, fully God and fully man, one with the Father, Jesus has one will with him, and he's coming down voluntarily. He's going to willingly lay down his life. He knows exactly what it's going to require. He understands the pain that is going to be felt and the misery that is going to be suffered, and yet he knows that is the only way that his sheep can actually be brought into the heavenly sheep pen. That's the only thing that's going to pay the price for them. There's this big predator that has to be taken out of play, and he is going to do it, but he's going to do it of his own decision, of his own will, and yet with God's sovereign desire behind it. This command I received from my Father. So it's a combination of both. Jesus is not being murdered by his Father, as some would argue. he's willingly doing this, which makes the act that much more significant, doesn't it? You think about, say if somebody coincidentally died for you or died for you as a stranger, that would be one thing. But somebody who willingly did it, knew who you were, knew your brokenness, and still decided to do it, that's pretty significant. All right, final verses, 19 through 21. The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, "He's demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him?" But others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" Okay, so again, as we've seen repeatedly, Jesus says these words, and people are trying to figure out, what on earth do I do with them? What do we take this to mean? And some of them are quickly saying, he's just demon-possessed, ignore everything he says. And others, I think more honestly, are saying, they don't seem like the words of a madman. Maybe they don't fully understand exactly what Jesus is getting at, but they seem like rational thoughts at least, and they're things that they can look around and witness in their own world. Maybe they don't understand the spiritual truth fully, but at least they're saying he seems rational. And I think there's a contrast here. When I think about somebody who's demon-possessed, I often think about somebody who is flailing around in the dirt with spit coming out of their mouth or something like that. That's sort of the stereotypical image of a demon-possessed person. Jesus doesn't flail around in the dirt with foaming spit come out of his mouth. Jesus is the guy who spits in the dirt, rubs it together, and gives sight to the blind. That's who Jesus is. This is a pretty big contrast. He's not living life like somebody who's demon-possessed. And frankly, if that's what demon possession looked like, we might be cheering for more of it, right? But that's not what it looks like. It looks like somebody whose life is being destroyed, somebody who's being hurt, is being brought down destructive spiritual paths and is being eroded by it. That's what demon possession would look like, and Jesus is nothing like that. So throughout this passage, Jesus is showing us who he is. He is the one way that we can enter into God's flock. He's the one way that we can actually have that access. He's also that shepherd who loves us, who cares for us, who's watching over us, who's interested in us having a full and complete life. And yet, strangely, unlike most of the sheep in the ancient world, we have the opportunity to choose who our shepherd is. For most sheep, you'd be born in a herd, and whoever your shepherd was, that's who it was. And unless he sold you, you were stuck there. But for us, we're given an invitation to choose what voice we listen to. I want to ask you again, as we close out our message today, in your own life, whose voice are you listening to? When you're making day-to-day decisions, I bet each of you has a decision in your life right now that you're making, where you're facing this decision of, do I listen to what God says and how he says I should handle this? Or do I listen to the world? Do I listen to these false teachers around? Or do I listen to the politicians or the talking heads on TV? Who do you seek your counsel from? Who do you trust with your life? If Jesus is your shepherd, then you're going to listen to him. And you'll hear his word, and you'll follow him. But if he's not, you have that freedom to make that decision. But understand, that's a distinction in your relationship. You're separated from him. And saying he's your shepherd, but never listening to his voice, that's just not a thing that happens. We're all listening to somebody. The question is who? I want to challenge you guys this week. Think of one major area in your life where you're making some decisions, and make sure that you're listening to the right shepherd when you do. God provided you with a shepherd infinitely better than anyone else who's ever walked the earth, certainly myself included. The shepherd actually died for you. He loves you so much, and he simply wants you to have that relationship with him. This is the one spiritual leader that will truly never fail you. He is there always. I'm going to ask Michael to come forward. He's going to lead us in communion offering, and Josh will lead us in a closing song. As they come forward, I'll ask you to join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, please guide our hearts this week, Lord. I don't know what decisions everybody here is making, and I don't know how often each of them is listening to you versus others. Frankly, sometimes I don't know how well I'm doing it, and I need to assess that myself. So I just pray this week you'd help us to see if there's areas in our life where you haven't been our shepherd in the way that you're supposed to be, not because you failed us, but because we refused to listen to you. I pray you'd show us those areas of disobedience, and I pray you'd help us to have full, abundant life through you, through walking in your truth. I pray this in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen.